Lady Frederick, a Monte Carlo novelization. The drawing room of the Hotel Splendide was one of those rooms that seemed to have learned posture. It knew how to hold itself in the presence of titles. Lamps pooled light on polished woods, a stove patted out its steady warmth. Beyond tall French windows, the terrace breathed the southern night, perfumed, starred, impossibly indulgent. Lady Meriston had chosen the armchair nearest the papers. She had chosen, too, a necklace that insisted on itself the way certain persons do at a dinner table, bracing, expensive, and very much aware of being seen. She turned a page with impatience and rang for a servant, any servant, because impatience is never lessened by privacy. "Did Mr. Paradine Folds come this evening?" "Yes, milady. He had come, and yes, he was in the hotel, and no, he could not be disturbed. Not by anyone, not until 10 o'clock, because Mr. Foldes had said as much, and men who spend a lifetime ordering other people's time love to be obeyed by the minute." "Send his man," Lady Meriston said, and presently Thompson, the sort of valet who could fold an accusation as crisply as a dress shirt, materialized. "Tell Mr. Foldes I should like to see him at once." Thompson consulted the law of Mr. Foldes's watch. "It is 5 minutes to 10, my lady." "Then it is 5 minutes too long," Lady Meriston replied, with the sudden heat of a woman who has both anxiety and a son. Paradine entered on the final chime, as if to prove clocks, too, were among his servants. He was the sort of man one calls well-preserved, in tones that admit he has pickled himself in experience. Urbane, immaculate, never flurried, impossible, frankly, to flurry. Lady Meriston kissed him, because sisters are allowed certain liberties regardless of their brothers' schedules. "You might have come sooner, Paradine." "My dear, after 27 hours in a train, a man ought to repair the injuries dealt to his person. It is not vanity, it is self-respect." He turned to the valet. "Thompson, did I dine?" Thompson, who for 25 years had been the custodian of his employer's facts, recited the menu with the calm of a parish clerk, listing the faithful departed. One by one, the dishes filed past until Lady Meriston, whose own dinner had been a single bite of anxiety, lost patience and cut through the comedy. "I sent for you because Charlie is in love." There are statements with the power to rearrange a room. This was not one. Monte Carlo had heard that sentence in all its languages and merely ruffled the curtains for effect. "Charlie is 22, Paradine said. "At 22, the disease is almost universal. If the lady is respectable, marry him and have done with it. If she is not, give her £500 and send her away in a cab." "It is Lady Frederick Berolles." Paradine's eyebrows expressed what others would need an expletive for. "By Jupiter." "She is 15 years his senior," Lady Meriston continued. "She improves her hair, and she paints, and she has no money. None. She rides with my son at dawn, steals him at tea, and supplants his sleep with roulette." "Then she is not dull," Paradine said, "which is nearly a virtue." But Lady Meriston's voice had gone taut. The heart of the matter was not virtue. It was future. "Charlie has a name to carry and a career to make. I can bear him to be mediocre in the proper fashion of our order. I cannot bear him to be preposterous." "And you have invited Lady Frederick to luncheon," Paradine guessed. "Of course. Do you suppose I would give her the theatre of my disapproval? No, I shall be devoted and kind and as close as lace, but I intend to find the thread in that lace that, once pulled, will unravel her." Paradine looked pleasantly blank. For him, blankness was a weapon more elegant than anger. "As I racketed a little in my youth. Your phrase, I think, I am to assist. My dear Paradine, a reformed burglar makes a talented detective. Reformed? He murmured. You flatter my rectitude. They were still smiling when the room's temperature leapt, no, danced, by degrees, because Lady Frederick herself swept in, a drift of silk and Irish mischief, with the young Marquis at her shoulder like a bright coin earned too fast. She brought weather with her. Rooms wanted to be weather when she entered them. Paradine, 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 she sang, crossing the floor with outstretched hands. He let his smile turn historical. Lady Frederick. And the room became a salon, and then a stage. Admiral Carlyle bluffly honest, Rose Carlyle sweet as a bell on Sunday, Gerald O'Mara handsome and too aware of it, Captain Montgomery polished as a new coin with a cold edge. Greetings and nonsense rose and fell like the sea. The mother suffered, the nephew sparkled, the uncle sat and witnessed as if already at work. It was on the terrace, beneath the star-milked sky, that Lady Frederick asked the Admiral for his daughter's future. Gerald has asked Rose to marry him, she said, and her brogue, employed as a violinist, employs a beloved instrument, softened the syllables till they looked like plea and wit at once. And she has said yes. She is much too young, the Admiral said, and the young man is penniless. That is why it is fortunate you are rich, Lady Frederick replied promptly. She flipped his objections as if they were flat stones and watched them skim. You adore Elizabethan facades? Splendid. Gerald's house burned down and was rebuilt as Georgian. You fear granddaughters? Impossible in our family. We breed sons like saints, breed anecdotes. He fought, of course. But when she spoke of her own marriage, the drunkenness, the years of compromise, the death of her boy, his resistance dulled. Pity is the enemy of resolve. He named at last a condition, a year without gambling, and then consent. Lady Frederick, whose impulse could sprint faster than propriety, threw her arms about the old sailor's neck and kissed him. He was astonished enough to blush like a lighthouse. Sir, she said, sometimes you are irresistible. Do you think so? He asked, in the tone of a man who has unexpectedly discovered he might be. When he and Rose had gone, the music fell from Lady Frederick's face. I am ruined, Gerald, she said softly. There are bills due the day after tomorrow. My promises last year to be economical have cost me double. Borrow, Gerald said. I have borrowed, she answered, and the humor returned, just enough to make honesty palatable. No one remains such an idiot as to lend to me twice. He offered his signature. She confessed she had offered both of theirs. The name that came between them like the smell of old coins was Cohen. There was no help there. Then Paradine returned, and life, obligingly theatrical, provided comedy. His bland catalogue of dinner courses, his mock-grieved distress about the toughness of a tornadoes, gave Lady Frederick just enough time to find her armor again. Do you want to marry Charlie? He asked abruptly when they were alone. I prefer my questions less obvious, she replied. You are in debt, he said. You have 2 bills falling due. You despise poverty and boredom equally. Here is my sister's suggestion. She who loves her son and hates you most virtuously. We will give you £40,000 to go away and refuse him. She considered throwing something. She considered throwing him. Instead, she laughed and shook her head. Would you accept 40,000 in cash when 50,000 a year in perpetuity were offered? Come, Paradine, you are cleverer than your own proposal. He sighed. Then my second card, your reputation. But Lady Frederick's wit was an excellent fencer. The moment he raised his blade, she parried. My dear, You cannot terrify me with the ghosts I dine with nightly. So you will not yield, he said lightly. Pity. You might have saved yourself ugliness. A thought crossed her face and settled. She rang for her dispatch box, opened it, and set before him a packet of letters addressed to 89 Grosvenor Square. Paradine recognized the handwriting even before the signature's bad endearments confirmed it. The late Lord Meriston's, his sainted brother-in-law, president of the Broadchurch Union, lecturer on English family life, lover of emeralds and the wrong little singer. Paradine was still laughing when the laughter broke into a soft, appalled silence at the thought of his sister. It would kill her, he said. Lady Frederick, watching him, said gently, "Would you like to burn them?" He took the letters to the stove, stopped, came back. "No," he muttered. "No, damn it. It is not fair to bind me to your magnanimity." "Very well," she said, slipping the packet away again. "Then we will return to our war." When he had gone, Captain Montgomery came in with his courtly stiffness and an expression polished by practice. He had a castle to mention, a townhouse to display, political ambitions packaged like cigars, and a proposal. "Dear Captain," Lady Frederick said, still smiling, still polite, "I am not in love with you." He smiled back, with patience. That need not be an impediment. But she was not a woman who needed to be taught the price of things. She could smell a ledger behind a compliment. He made his offer clear. Money for position, liberty for respectability, the use of her name for the rescue of her debts. When she refused, he uncoiled the last weapon calmly. The 2 bills due the day after tomorrow were, it appeared, now in his pocketbook. He had bought them from Cohen. Also in his possession, Gerald's IOU for £900. "There is no need for tragedy," he said pleasantly. "If you accept me, you need never know that I held them. And if I do not, then I shall do as the law suggests." When he had gone, the room was very quiet. Lady Frederick sat with her hands in her lap and her mouth invisibly trembling. The stove hummed. Somewhere, a woman in the next room laughed too loudly at a joke not worth the sound. She lifted her chin. "We will see," she said, to the person who had least deserted her in life, herself. Second, an artist of hair and other artists. Morning found Admiral Carlyle asleep in a chair the size of a small confession box, a handkerchief flung across his face as if modesty could be worn. Rose sat primly, being good at that, which is not the same as being dull. Gerald leaned over the back of her chair entirely, as a man in love should. They discussed, as if they had a right to the future, where their son would go to university. Their son, who did not yet exist. Trinity. Magdalen. The Admiral shot upright, outraged by hope. Lady Frederick, arriving in time to enjoy the farce, soothed everyone back into laughter and sense. But when she and Gerald were alone, sense was a house with no furniture. "Cohen has sold the bills," she said. "I do not know to whom. Perhaps Paradine, though I think not, but whoever has them is clever enough to stay hidden." "Montgomery," Gerald whispered. "I shall see him today." Paradine drifted in then, as men drift when they have news they intend to use. He was buoyant, a bad sign for an enemy, but his buoyancy had a warning threaded in it. "My sister is jubilant," he told Betsy, almost kindly. "She holds something she thinks will finish you, the old Bellingham business. If only for friendship's sake, be prepared." "Paradine," she smiled, "I am always prepared. It is accounting that ruins me." At which point, the footman announced Madame Claude. a dressmaker whose arrival would have outfitted a battle. The lady's face had been composed in a mirror for sternness. Lady Frederick, who had her own stagecraft, met her with a flood of affection that turned sternness into a shiver of pride. "An artist!" Lady Frederick cried. "Look, Paradine, genius resides in this flounce." Madame Claude had come to collect money. Instead, she found herself being asked to luncheon with an archduchess, the Marquis of Meriston, Mr. Paradine Folds, whom she had always understood to be admirably wicked, and a prince with cheekbones to fit the word. She held on to dignity with both hands. "I did not come for money," she said stoutly, though Bills had been rehearsing speeches in her reticule since breakfast. "How disappointing," Lady Frederick answered, reaching for pen and paper with exaggerated resignation. "For once, I am resolved to pay." A stamp appeared from Paradine's pocket with the irritating readiness of a man who has spent his life in the company of complications. Lady Frederick wrote a cheque with the dramatic sigh of a martyr, and then, when Madame Claude nearly wept and begged her not to degrade their friendship, tore it up into confetti. "Paradine," she murmured as he escorted the dressmaker out. "You see, the only profitable way to treat one's creditors is with affection." He shook his head, half laughing. "You are a scandal," he said, "which is what men say when they are pleased." He had barely gone when Montgomery arrived, unexpectedly early, unexpectedly certain. Lady Frederick thanked him coolly for his generosity to Gerald. He smiled with glossy patience and asked for her answer. "I cannot marry you," she said. "Then I am afraid business must intrude on sentiment." He set her bills on the table and asked for payment. When she could not pay, he observed that the law would do as it must. She told him to have done with threats and to take his ugly tools away. He left with a bow that rewarded his tailor beautifully. A few minutes later, Lady Meriston swept in, with Charlie and Paradine at her heels. Charlie's face, open as weather, was eager with pity and longing, and a courage he did not yet know was insufficient. Lady Meriston, pale with righteousness, had prepared a scene. She would not have called it a scene. She would have called it maternal duty. "My son is infatuated," she announced. "It is time we spoke plainly." The plainness she chose was the Bellingham story, a letter she had obtained at great cost and with greater satisfaction. She thrust it into Lady Frederick's hand like a knife. Lady Frederick read it, then handed it to Charlie. He turned white. "Read it," she said, and when he could not, she read for him. The letter admitted guilt, where there had been none, her own. It was, she explained, a legal fiction of the heart. Her sister-in-law had been weak and had erred. She had been frightened and contrite. She had begged for protection. Lady Frederick had offered the shield of her own reputation. It had been effective, and the marriage had survived. All three parties to the tale were now dead, and it cost no one living a tear for her to tell the truth. "You cannot prove it," Lady Meriston said sharply. "I do not care to," Lady Frederick replied. "I am not defending myself in your court." Paradine, whose instincts for truth were better than his habits, said simply, "I believe her," to which Lady Meriston had no answer that would not cost her dignity. Lady Frederick turned to the footman. "Albert, fetch my dispatch box." "Betsy, don't," Paradine murmured, reading the intention in her eyes. But she had borne enough. When the letters lay in her hand once more, she crossed to the stove, opened the little door, and fed the paper to the mild orange flames, one by one. The stove made a kind sound, like an old dog settling. "If you call on me in London, my lord," she said to Charlie without looking at him. "You will be told I am not at home." Lady Meriston, who had intended to triumph, felt the spoiled taste of it in her mouth. Charlie stepped forward and apologized to Lady Frederick for all of it, the suspicions, the insults, the hunt. His words were raw and sincere. His love rose to his throat and overflowed. He asked her to marry him. He begged, beautiful as boys are when they beg. "Come tomorrow at 10, Lady Frederick said softly, smiling as one smiles at a brave child. "I will give you your answer." Paradine, watching her, recognized the bright mischief, the plotted mercy. He bowed to it as to talent on a stage. The third, the mirror at 10 o'clock. The light over Lady Frederick's dressing table was the light of judgment, unflattering, pitiless, clean. Most women would have drawn the blind and lied. She left it up. "Is that you, Charlie?" she called through the curtain. "You're very punctual. I am not yet dressed. You may throw me conversation while I put myself together." When she came through the curtains, she wore a silk kimono and an absence of disguise. Her hair, her famous hair, hung in a bewildered tangle. The face, cherished and coveted by a score of dinner tables, was soft with fatigue and marked with the small calamities of 30-something. A touch of yellow under the eyes, a line that had not been there in spring. Charlie started. He forced the start into a smile at once, which was kind and made no difference. "Angelique," Lady Frederick called, "do my hair like a crisis." Her maid, whose profession had taught her to treat moods as materials, gathered the dark mass with graceful competence. She spoke, as all good Parisian maids do, in a pursuit. If her ladyship required pathos, hair must be lifted high. For bad news, one draws it low. For comedy, temple curls. They talked about nothing essential and everything essential. Hair touching, youth failing, powder and hope, and the difficulty of rouge on two symmetrical cheeks. Lady Frederick, with the candor of a surgeon who loves his patient, explained the makeup of her face the way another woman might have recited poetry. She built her complexion in layers: balm against lamp glare, powder against the day, color for health, a little art for the arch of an eyebrow, a little pencil for the drama of a shadow. "Smile," she commanded lightly as she worked. "No, don't breathe for a moment. A breath can ruin a line and a day and a reputation." Charlie obeyed because he loved her and because she asked. He felt clumsy in a world of small, exact gestures that turned a woman into the idea of a woman. When the hair was finished and the face restored to the version Monte Carlo adored, she slipped away to dress. She returned a minute later, wrapped in a gown whose lace complicated analogy. "Now," she said and sat, "you must ask me again." He did. He asked with all that was best in him: earnestness, fidelity, humility. He offered her his youth as if it were a house. He promised to live soberly in it. "My dear boy," she answered, and took his hand, "I have given you the answer for the past half hour." He stared. "You cannot have supposed I would let you see the manufacture of my illusions if I intended to live on them with you," she said, with a crooked tenderness. "I love you in a fashion, Charlie. I am enchanted by you, but it would be murder for us both. In 10 years, you will be 32 and handsomer still. I shall be fighting every morning with form and light and losing, because light always wins. There is a kind girl in England whose bloom is ungoverned by any rouge. She will be kind to you." He said he did not care, which is what men say at 22 when they care very much. He said he had wanted to save her. She forgave him that too, because she knew how to read love and how to be grateful for its intentions without accepting its terms. "Be happy," she said at last, and because she could not kiss him without leaving a mark, she let the kiss shine in her eyes instead. He went away with a heart full of grief and respect and an odd, aching freedom, the charity of a wise refusal. Paradine arrived as the door closed on Charlie's grief. "Am I to congratulate my new niece?" he asked. "No," she answered. "You are to confess that you ever thought me foolish enough to marry a boy who thinks me a goddess. Imagine having to live as the goddess you are mistaken for." "Then why this pantomime?" he asked, though he knew. "Because you interfered," she said, "and because I like him." Before he could say something sentimental, Paradine kept sentiment at arm's length on principle, which is the only way he could bear the amount he carried. Gerald and Rose burst in, towing the Admiral, all three in that state of scandalized happiness that follows confession and absolution. "I told him," Gerald cried, "everything. The IOU and Montgomery's threats." "And I wrote the check," the Admiral added, almost gruff with his own generosity. It is indecent to let a scoundrel walk about believing himself omnipotent. "Admiral," Lady Frederick said, "you are a dear man." He shifted like a large ship, adjusting anchor, and then, encouraged by his own goodness and by something brighter in Lady Frederick's eye than gratitude, asked abruptly if she would marry him. It was so unexpected she nearly laughed and nearly wept. She turned it, quickly and kindly, into nonsense about family trees tying themselves into knots if they were not careful. He accepted the joke with only a little disappointment, which is a courageous way to accept anything. At that moment, the footman announced Captain Montgomery. "Send him in," Lady Frederick said, with a serenity that electrified the room. He came in smiling, and saw at once he had chosen a bad audience. He asked for privacy and was refused it. When Gerald told him a check had been sent, he said he had not received it, and took out, with the elegance of a magician producing a dove, Lady Frederick's bills. "You must pay today." "I cannot," she said simply. "Then I will have an order," he replied. "Bankruptcy is not agreeable." "It is more agreeable," she said, and her voice went very soft, "than marrying a bully." Paradine stood and asked to see the documents. He studied them as if they were specimens. Then, without fanfare, he wrote a check for the whole and laid it on the table. Montgomery's mask slipped. "I forgot you," he said, and swore, and tried to pretend he had not. "The window or the door?" Paradine asked pleasantly. "Choose the one that suits your dignity." Montgomery chose the door. "You are a good friend," Lady Frederick said when the room had exhaled. "Yesterday you burned letters that could have ruined my sister." Paradine answered, "I am paying 5% on that capital." "You may squeeze my hands," she said, laughing and crying together, "but do not be kind to me. It makes me feel fragile." "Then I will be practical. I am very tired, Betsy, of being clever for no reason. I have bought a small house in Norfolk Street where I intend to cultivate virtue and herbs. One requires a housekeeper." He paused a heartbeat. "Will you come?" She looked at him with the sort of look that simplifies the face to its child. "Do you like me still?" she whispered, astonished by her own question. "After all these years?" "Yes," he said, and suffered sentiment to cross the room and sit down. She went into his arms like a thought going home. "What will your sister say?" she asked finally, hiccuping laughter. "That I saved Charlie from your clutches in the only safe way," Paradine replied gravely. By marrying you, myself. Monster, she murmured, and lifted her mouth. Fourth coda, the light beyond the terrace. The Hotel Splendide resumed its posture. The stove kept the peace it had made. Beyond the terrace, the night uncorked its patient stars. Beyond the stars, perhaps, a kindness had been written into the order of things, that men and women should sometimes be permitted to save one another at the last possible moment, that debts might be paid in coin other than money, that age, when it meets age without disguise, can be sweeter than spring in a city built for gambling. Lady Meriston would not be delighted. Mothers are not obliged to be delighted. But in time, even she might recollect the feel of humiliation cooling into relief. Charlie would marry a girl whose bloom did not require artistry. Gerald and Rose would quarrel about Dublin and Oxford and kiss over Cambridge. And the Admiral would practice saying, "My son," in a tone that looked like thunder and meant sunshine. Madame Claude would tell the Archduchess that the upper classes, for all their airs, did still understand flounces. And Captain Montgomery would learn anew the despair of discovering that not everything can be bought, and that sometimes the right man is in the room at the wrong time and carries a check in his pocket like a weapon. As for Lady Frederick, she would have a dressing table in Norfolk Street and sunlight at 10 o'clock that would be allowed to fall just as harsh as always. She would take down the pots and pencils still and draw the brows of mischief and survival where she wanted them. Paradine would sit in a chair and pretend to scoff because some positions are too long held to be released easily. And then he would watch her through the glass and love her better because of what the glass showed. Paradine, she might say, tilting her face to judge a shade, do you suppose one can grow old well? My dear Betsy, he would answer, we shall do it extravagantly. And in a room that had learned posture, they would laugh, as if laughter were also a way of spending money, and they were finally rich enough to spend it freely. The luncheon that ought never to have worked, and did. The Archduchess possessed a gift for enjoying what she ought not to enjoy. She had been born to solemnities and spent her middle years avoiding them. What she liked best was to be amused in a way she might credibly deny later. She arrived for luncheon, wrapped in violets and tact, with a little snuff-box she never used and a lorgnette she used for everything. The party Lady Frederick had blithely invited into existence. The Archduchess, Madame Claude, Lord Meriston, who had not yet recovered from being refused, Mr. Paradine Fould, who had fully recovered from everything, and a prince with cheekbones that justly occupied 2 places on the guest list, looked improbable on paper and more improbable across the table. Madame Claude wore composure and a hat with moral authority. She had sworn in the carriage that she would not be impressed. The Archduchess's title measured itself against Madame's scissor hand. The verdict came in the first 5 minutes, when the Archduchess leaned across and said, Madame, your sleeve seams never betray you, which is, among dressmakers, roughly equivalent to a knighthood. I do what I can, Madame Claude murmured modestly, and proceeded to do far more. Within the hour, she had recommended a trimmer in Nice who understood the fall of a cuff as a moral problem, accepted a commission to alter an archducal bodice without changing its character, and made a note to tell every English client for the next 6 months that her work had been singled out by royalty. She had not come for money, it was true, but she left richer. Paradine, tasting the wine with an air of private counsel for a vineyard, watched Lady Frederick keep the table alight. When she sparred with the prince over the design of Crowley Castle's North Terrace, a subject embarrassingly introduced by Captain Montgomery in a brief visit to the ante-room that ended quickly, she was all nimble mockery. When the Archduchess mourned a cousin exiled to marry a Dutchman with no ear for opera, Lady Frederick found sympathy without heaviness. She refused to be grand, and so made everyone else feel grander. Lord Meriston tried twice to speak privately to her. Twice she lifted a hand, not unkindly, simply enough, and turned back to the Archduchess, who had asked about a milliner in Paris and whether the rumors of her genius were deserved. The young man's humiliation was accomplished without cruelty. That is the neatest kind. As the party broke, Paradine offered the Archduchess his arm. "Your Highness," he said, as if to an old conspirator, "you must admit that Monte Carlo never yet produced a luncheon that ran on time or sense. We have achieved both." "My dear Mr. Folds," the Archduchess replied, glancing back at Lady Frederick with a small, satisfied smile, "some women organize a table the way other women organize a household. Lady Frederick organizes how one feels." "Useful," said Paradine. "Dangerous," said the Archduchess, "and delightful." Sixth Lady Meriston's education. It is not easy to be educated against one's will past the age of 40. Lady Meriston had, in her life, learned everything she intended to learn. Proper letters to write, proper hats to choose, proper opinions to hold. She had not intended to be taught mercy. But the lesson arrived, as such lessons do, wrapped as humiliation, so that one might open it slowly. She waited until the house returned to its original temperature, and then sent for Paradine. He came as if he had been passing the door, and chose not to be rude. This was one of his ways of being kind. "You paid her bills," she said without preface. "I prevented a vulgarity," he corrected. "My son—" "Will not marry her," Paradine said. "He has been refused, skillfully, which is an art, and forgiven, which is a virtue." Lady Meriston, who did not believe in art and rarely encountered virtue, searched Paradine's face for something to blame. "You are very pleased with yourself." "No," he answered truthfully, "only with her." "And with me?" she asked, surprising herself. "With you," he said after a small pause, "I am resigned." She might have been angry, that was her right, but she was tired of being right. "Those letters," she said, "you knew what they were. You knew what they would do to me." "Yes," he said, "and you knew also." Her eyes fell. "I thought I would finally be rid of her," she whispered. "My dear Maud, do not try to rid yourself of people by ruining them. One only acquires more of them that way. They're shadows." She would have preferred a lecture. She knew how to guard herself against those. A single accurate sentence required her to step aside and yield the field. "What am I to do with Charlie?" she asked. "Make him busy," Paradine said. "He has the ardor of a man who needs work. Give him committees and causes and the illusion of consequence. If he is useful, the pain will have less space." "You talk as if love were a triviality," she objected. Paradine looked at her with a slow regard. "I talk as a man who has once waited at Waterloo without a hat and with all his pride in a handkerchief," he said. "Love is not trivial, but it has a calendar, and one must keep it moving." She looked up sharply. "And now? Has your calendar concluded?" "On the contrary," he said, bland again. "I intend to be married." There was a silence in which all her doctrines leapt to their feet. "To whom?" she asked, though she knew. "To the woman you have worked so hard to despise." Lady Meriston stood up because sitting made her feel smaller. "You cannot expect me to welcome this." "Good heavens, no," he said, "only to survive it." And if I do not, then I fear you shall have to live a long time to regret it thoroughly, which you might perversely enjoy." She pressed her lips to keep them from betraying her. "I loved my husband," she said suddenly, and looked away, as if the statement might blush. Paradine's voice softened before he permitted it. "Yes," he said, "and he loved you in his way. I shall try not to think of him more than necessary." She very nearly laughed. "Paradine," she said wearily, "please go away before I say something you will enjoy pronouncing wicked." He bowed. "My dear Maud, I have never enjoyed anything wicked. I have merely avoided being bored." She did laugh then, in spite of herself. It was, after all, a beginning. Seventh Interlude, Thompson's Practical Theology. Thompson had always believed that God rewarded precision. In his theology, angels wore white gloves and folded shirts by a system. He did not care for Monte Carlo. It was a place where money fidgeted. But Mr. Foldy's had a look in the eye that suggested caprice and intention were about to marry, and Thompson respected any union properly conducted. He watched as his master paid a sum that could have furnished a nursery and chose to think of it as disposing of dust. Money, in his long experience, behaved best when treated as particle rather than idle. He passed Lady Frederick's maid in the corridor, Angelique, the very picture of neatness, except in the region of eyelashes, which had been designed by a dramatist. "You have a very good situation," he remarked gravely, as if a magistrate asking after an alibi. She lifted a shoulder. "I have a very good mistress. Is she difficult?" "She is alive," Angelique said. "It has the same results and none of the dullness." Thompson considered this a philosophic answer and disapproved. Still, he thought, the household that was forming in Norfolk Street might prove functional. He made a list in his head of the linen required and added, as a matter of private piety, a silver salver just large enough for reconciliations. The 8th year. Paradine and Lady Frederick married in London 3 weeks after Monte Carlo, in a church that had more confidence than beauty. Society received the news with a mixture of smirk and relief. Smirk because it was sweet to see a notorious bachelor harnessed. Relief because it placed Lady Frederick where she could be seen and not tripped over. Norfolk Street, Park Lane, wore virtue like a well-cut coat. There were dinners for 6 that began promptly and ended before anyone confessed a political opinion. There were mornings when Lady Frederick sent notes to friends, and afternoons when those friends begged to call and be alone with her for half an hour. There were quiet quarrels between husband and wife, conducted in a tone so amused that servants could not repeat them to one another coherently. Paradine did not reform. He refined. He continued to eat what he liked, to drink when thirsty, to despise boredom, to get up late and avoid going to bed early. But he listened, really listened, when Betsy talked about other people, and he discovered that gossip conducted by a mind like hers was a species of anthropology. She, for her part, adopted 2 domestic policies. First, to banish the word ought from their breakfast table. Second, to pay cash for flowers. The first made conversation cheerful. The second prevented debt from creeping in with the peonies. They did not perform happiness. They practiced it. Meanwhile, the year unwound as if set to a good metronome. Gerald kept his promise. He did not gamble. He learned it was possible to fill his hands with other things: dogs, a gun, the bridle of a horse that insisted on thinking, and long letters to Rose in which he explained that virtue was occasionally a bore but significantly cheaper. Rose married him at the year's end in a dress whose seams did not betray anyone and discovered that the word husband, which had frightened her by its sound, did not frighten her in practice. The Admiral took to grandfatherhood as a man takes to a pipe he has wanted secretly for 40 years. He laid down rules for the future that everyone ignored and did not mind being ignored. He came to dine in Norfolk Street once a month and fought tolerably with Paradine about naval appropriations and the sins of the First Lord. Lady Frederick liked him, as one likes a large chair with fewer angles than it threatens. Captain Montgomery, who had imagined that a check would repair his pride as cement repairs a crack, discovered the fracture ran upward into the wall. He stood for Parliament in a district that wanted someone less exact and more sympathetic. He lost politely. Select houses did not open to him. In compensation, many restaurants did. He was too intelligent to be ridiculous and too proud to be loved. He made money very efficiently and friendlessness inefficiently, and sometimes, when he caught sight of Lady Frederick across a ballroom and watched her laugh at her husband's low murmur, something inside him folded a letter that had never been posted. Lady Meriston's education proceeded. She did not love Betsy and did not pretend to, but she learned to greet her without rehearsing her lines in advance, and even to write a note once when influenza knocked Norfolk Street sideways and left Paradine equal parts peevish and charming, offering excellent soup and a better novel. Betsy replied with equal politeness that the soup had saved a marriage and the novel had threatened it. As for Charlie, his was the most delicate work. The young do not always require cures, they often require occupations. He built one by degrees, not as his uncle had suggested. Paradine's idea of useful work being a list of committees, but out of something earnest. He found that the cause of slum housing, with its undeserved profits and deserved shame, stirred the parts of him that had loved foolishly. He did not discuss this with his mother. Instead, he presented her with results that looked like propriety, speeches in dull rooms, checks with his father's name in the signature, visits to the less picturesque parts of London. In time, the ache that had been Lady Frederick became something else, a bias toward kindness that, if it persisted, would be called character. Ninth, domestic, a scene in Norfolk Street. "Tell me," Paradine said, one rainy Tuesday, "if I were to die tomorrow, would you weep?" "Certainly," Lady Frederick said. "At 6:30, the rest of the day is busy. I should expect at least a full morning." "My dear," she replied, "grief early in the day leads to bread and butter for luncheon, and never any hot dishes. It is an economy I shall not practice." He studied her over his coffee cup. "You are heartless." "You are not observant," she returned. "I am excellent at grief. I merely decline to rehearse it." He put the cup down and reached for her hand. "What shall we do this afternoon?" "Nothing," she said promptly. "It is the only pastime to which I am naturally inclined." "In that case," he said content, "we shall do it together." At 4 o'clock, the Admiral came to call and thundered about a political scandal that had bored him all morning and now required witnesses. At 5, Thompson, with the bearing of a messenger announcing a small invasion, conveyed a request from Lady Meriston for 2 tickets to a charity musicale. At 6, having wept privately, at exactly the promised minute, over a poem that was bad but contained a line she could not forgive, Lady Frederick dressed for dinner with a degree of care that would have ensured a worse woman's salvation. 10. The return to Monte Carlo. They went back once in spring, because places that have been kind to us are like graveyards for certain pains. One goes to see whether the headstones are still standing. Monte Carlo wore the same face, though some of its freckles had shifted. The Splendid welcomed them with the unfussy gratitude of a hotel that remembers good bills and better stories. At breakfast on their second day, Lady Frederick pointed out an elderly couple at the far window, the man patient, the woman anxious with a paper bag. "He has promised to stop," she said softly. "She has promised to oversee him. Neither will be vindicated." "Shall we interfere?" Paradine asked to tease. "I am reformed in many particulars," she said. "Interference is not among them." They walked the terrace as they had long ago, and Paradine asked unexpectedly, "What would you do if we had a child?" She stopped. "We will not," she said gently, and her mouth, which had grown freer with truth since marriage, folded at the corner. "I have practiced the past tense long enough to earn its privileges." "I should have been insufferable as a father," he said, after a moment. "I should have audited the nursery and brought home tropical fruits." "You are insufferable now," she told him, "and I have learned to forgive almost everything except lychees." They stood a while by the low wall, looking out at a sea that had forgotten them and would continue to. It is one of the better qualities of the sea. That evening, at the tables, Paradine lost money with style and won back some of it with less. Lady Frederick played for 5 minutes, lost once, won once, rose at once. "I have done my duty to chance," she said. "We will do our duty to continuity. There is a small restaurant 3 streets away that makes an honest omelette." "Honest," Paradine drawled. "You are making me timid." "You will endure it," she replied, taking his arm. "You have borne worse." 11th Lady Meriston's second lesson. It was a little party, only 6 at dinner in Norfolk Street on a night when the weather committed to rain as if it were a cause. Lady Meriston arrived with a new restraint and an old necklace. Charlie came late, apologizing, without fuss. Gerald and Rose were the sort of married couple who still touched each other's sleeves when they laughed. The Admiral had a cold and announced it with an air of personal betrayal by the Navy. Lady Frederick placed them cleverly, not to produce effects. She had given up most effects, but to prevent accidents. She put Lady Meriston between Paradine and Charlie. She put the Admiral opposite a wall, since one cannot be expected to talk sense across soup. She placed Rose where she could be admired without effort, and Gerald where he could admire without being caught. Conversation tripped, recovered, and began to run. Charlie mentioned a bill in the Lords that would, quietly, modestly, force a slum landlord to repair a staircase. Lady Meriston, who had often descended stairs without wondering whether others could, listened and then asked precise questions as if she were evaluating a dress and feared to choose wrongly. The Admiral snorted and volunteered to box the landlord's ears. Paradine offered a story about a duke who had once evicted his conscience to make room for a new spaniel. Rose pretended to scold Gerald for his new habit of walking around London, seeing things he would previously have called improprieties, as if the word ended the conversation. No one mentioned Monte Carlo or emeralds or letters burned for kindness. It was the second lesson, that one could talk of anything when one has agreed, quietly, anonymously, not to talk of the wrong things. After dinner, Lady Meriston lingered. The men had gone into the library, the young ones to argue earnestly, the older ones to argue for form. Rose had a headache and was being fed tea and nonsense by Angelique, who administered both with distinction. "You have made my son useful," Lady Meriston said abruptly, as if confessing a crime. "He made himself so Lady Frederick replied. I merely refused to be the hobby he might have indulged instead. You burned those letters, Lady Meriston continued. Yes, Lady Frederick said. You see, I do not keep souvenirs of the wrong people. Lady Meriston looked down at her hands. You must think me ridiculous. I rarely think of you at all, Lady Frederick said cheerfully. When I do, it is to wish you would wear fewer emeralds in daylight. They are hard on the complexion. Paradine said, you would always win, Lady Meriston murmured, not smiling. Paradine, Lady Frederick said, often says what will best amuse him. I recommend the practice. Lady Meriston drew a breath that might one day be mistaken for a sigh. I shall return your soup tureen, she said, and then, startling herself again, added, and will you come with me next week to Whitechapel? I am making an inspection, and am weary of the women who accompany me. They bring the wrong hats. Lady Frederick stood. I have the right hat for all inspections, she said. When shall we go? It was, for both women, more than an outing. It was the shape of a treaty between two small, stubborn sovereign states. 12th Montgomery at Crowley. Crowley Castle, purchased with desiring money and dressed with labouring taste, suffered from a defect of romance. It had been bought. Captain Montgomery had the good sense to know this, and the vanity to hope no one else would notice. He installed pictures large enough to convince visitors they were important, and placed chairs where a man might be trapped into conversation with a portrait of someone better born. He hunted, he hosted, he calculated. Gentlemen came for the birds, ladies came for the bedrooms, society came because its carriage horses needed exercise, and there are only so many directions one can go in winter. Yet, quietly at the margins, Montgomery did something no one predicted. He grew a conscience in patches, like grass through gravel. He allowed a ruined tenant to remain rent-free for a season. He rebuilt a cottage because he could not abide the sight of smoke, leaving a roof the way sorrow leaves a face. He dismissed a steward who cheated in small amounts, the most intolerable kind of thief, being hard to catch and harder to boast of catching. He still wanted what he had always wanted and did not repent, but he learned to feel, which is a more dangerous conversion. One summer, when the roses along the southern wall were doing their level best to absolve him, he received a letter on paper he had once coveted. Mr. Folds and I are passing through your county, the letter said, in Lady Frederick's neat hand. We will not trespass. We will merely report if your terrace is as ugly as your description. Yours, etc. He folded the letter, set it on the mantel, and laughed once. He did not reply. But that evening, he stood on the terrace as the light thinned and admitted to himself that Crowley would always lack something that no architect could supply: a history that forgave him. 13. A little scene about money, which is about something else. Paradine returned from his club one wet January with an expression that made Thompson move a decanter 2 inches nearer to the proper place. I have rescued an acquaintance from debt, he announced to Betsy in the tone of a man admitting to ordering pudding. He had borrowed against everything but his children's futures, which he was saving for a rainy day. How much? She asked, practical as all former prodigals must be. The amount is vulgar, he said, the act moderately commendable. Shall we afford magnanimity? She asked lightly, though she had kept their accounts these 2 years with a precision that would have startled some of her former creditors into respect. We shall, he answered, because one day we may require it, and because I am still trying to deserve you." She tilted her head. "You cannot possibly still be auditioning." "My love," he said gravely, "I intend to audition for the rest of my life." She walked over and put her arms around his neck, with a sigh that was more amused than soft. "Your role is secure," she told him. "Only do not begin to give away the orchids. I draw the line at botany." "Agreed," he said, and kissed her. 14th Charlie's letter. The letter arrived at breakfast on a Wednesday, filled with unpromising sunshine. Lady Frederick read it, and then handed it to Paradine, who read aloud with approval. "My dear Lady Frederick, you will forgive me the liberty of writing, when silence would be more elegant. I think you may be pleased to know that Miss Talbot has promised to marry me. She is the daughter of the clergyman at St. Judith's, whom you may remember as the church with the single-minded bell. She has never been to Monte Carlo and has no wish to. She is the sort of person who makes one's opinion of the world kinder. I am ashamed to think of the trouble I once gave you, and no longer ashamed to be grateful. I will be in London next month for a small speech in the Lords about staircases. If you are at home, I will send for news of your health from the landing. Yours sincerely, Meriston." "Good," Paradine said. "He has found someone who will not require a dictionary." "Or a powder," Betsy nodded, smiling. "I hope she will make him dull." "You are ferocious." "I am practical," she retorted. "The best husbands are dull to society and extremely vivid to their wives." 15. 2 Quiet Mercies. The first came on a day when the Morning Post brought a small, precise envelope addressed in Lady Meriston's hand. Inside, a card. "Thank you for your kindness in Monte Carlo. M." It was not an apology. It was not a surrender. It was, as Betsy said, looking at it sideways, a species of courtesy that hoped to become habit. The second arrived unannounced. Lady Frederick and Paradine were walking along the river in April, the air full of other people's engagements and a whiff of damp wool. A boy ran past, tripped, and would have fallen if the woman behind him, brown-haired, plain, and splendid with capability, had not caught the back of his coat in the instant before gravity took full possession. "Careful, Kit," she said, and her voice, Betsy noticed such things, held the right mixture of fear and command. "Miss Talbot," Paradine murmured, as if he had never doubted Providence would arrange the encounter. "And little Kit." "Not yet," Betsy said, "but eventually." Miss Talbot looked up and recognized them and smiled as if she were willing to be pleased. They spoke for 5 minutes about indifferent topics: the weather, the river, the bells of St. Judith's that insisted on being rung by the youngest persons available. When they parted, Betsy said softly, "He will be all right." "Yes," Paradine agreed. "We will both be forgiven by proxy." 16. What happened after. People prefer finales to be tidy. Life, being ill-bred, resists. Still, one can make an end without lying. Gerald and Rose had 2 daughters in quick succession, and a son who arrived late and looked as if he'd been enjoying himself elsewhere. Gerald gamed no more, except at patience and lawn tennis. Rose read to him at night from books that had never been fashionable enough to be disliked. The Admiral softened by degrees until he reminded everyone of the weather in Devon. Blustery, fond, regretting nothing loudly, he held his grandson as if holding the future by the middle and set about spoiling it to a precise plan. Captain Montgomery received an invitation, astonishingly, to a large dinner in Norfolk Street. He accepted, of course. One must. He sat 3 places down from Lady Frederick and was treated with the sort of respect one gives to someone who will always be clever and sometimes kind. He left at 11, neither sorry he had come nor sorry to go. He would, at 60, marry a widow whose sense of humour disarmed him and whose debts he paid with a sort of relief that resembled happiness. Crowley gradually became less of an argument and more of a home. Lady Meriston learned to visit Norfolk Street when no other invitations remained in the week. She and Betsy developed a way of being together that would, in another century, have been named friendship. In theirs it was called civility, which was safer. Charlie spoke about staircases and then about drains, and the newspapers found themselves switching from ridicule to boredom to approval, which is the proper order for progress in England. His wife, whom society called a nobody until she became somebody by accident, taught him to laugh at the right moments and not despair at the wrong ones. Thompson polished, observed, and carried messages between people who loved one another and did not always admit it. Angelique ruled an empire of pins and combs and slipped into marriage with a hairdresser from Mayfair who revered her the way some men reverence the church. They quarrelled at intervals about the morality of fringes. Norfolk Street remained the hermitage they had promised themselves. There were seasons when gaiety revived. For a month, they went out as if they had been paid to be seen. There were seasons when they did not attend anything with more ceremony than breakfast. Paradine read books that made him unfit for dinner conversation, and books that made him excellent at it. Lady Frederick wrote notes on thick paper that made other women feel chosen, and then failed to attend their concerts with a grace that prevented offence. They returned to Monte Carlo twice more. The place became a mirror they could look into kindly. One afternoon, late in their 5th year, when London astonished itself by providing sunlight, Lady Frederick paused at her dressing table before a drawer she rarely opened. She drew out the little packet of emeralds Mimi Le Breton had offered, and she had impulsively refused, tokens long since sent to her in a last will that was half apology, half gratitude. She looked at them as if they were a rumour about someone who resembled her. Paradine came in without knocking, and saw the stones glittering as if night had placed pieces of itself on the wood. "I have always disliked emeralds," he said mildly. "They are so pleased with their own virtue." "And yet," Betsy began, and smiled. "Number I shall send them to a niece we do not yet have. She may sober them." "Or they may sober her," he said. "We shall see," she answered, returning the packet to the drawer and closing it decisively. He crossed to her and stood behind, meeting her eyes in the glass. Those eyes he had first praised as belladonna and later learned to praise without jokes. The light, even at 10 o'clock, was kinder now, or perhaps they had trained it. "Do you think we have grown old well?" he asked, not unseriously. "I think," she said, "we are still spending our money foolishly and our time wisely." "May it continue," he said. She rose, and he helped her, unnecessarily and entirely as if it were necessary. They went in to dinner. There were flowers on the table, paid for that morning in cash, and a soup the Admiral would have scolded as insufficient, and a wine that would have invited Madame Claude to confess who made her gowns now. What they had, to put it plainly, was enough. 17th curtain. If you must. The Splendide, if pressed, would remember them as a pair who laughed softly and tipped well. Monte Carlo would remember them as a lucky story. London, with its respectful amnesia, would fold them into itself as one folds clean linen into a cupboard, not to be displayed, but relied upon. It is possible to spend a life in smaller heroism. Betsy, Lady Frederick, to those who needed titles in order to feel tidy, found that the wildness which once defended her could be domesticated into kindness. Paradine discovered that cleverness improves markedly when attached to affection. Between them, they built a society of two that did not require any other to be dissolved. If you need, for your comfort, to be told what happened at the very end, ask a novelist. He will lie beautifully for you. Ask a valet. He will tell you nothing and arrange your tie. Ask a woman who has learned to keep her dispatch box locked and her heart not quite, and she will say, "We went on," which, really, is the best ending of all.